Have you ever wondered what true evil looks like?
He is the monster that we've all come to know him for.
Meet Oskar Dirlewanger, a name synonymous with terror in the annals of history.
One whose story was brutal, evil, and malicious. That bandit king who goes by the name of Oskar Dirlewanger.
This SS general, known for his psychopathic brutality, led a life drenched in infamy. But what led him down this dark path? Let's delve into the sinister world of Dirlewanger, unveiling the story behind one of the most feared men in Nazi Germany. The making of a monster. Oskar Dirlewanger's story is not just a tale of a man turning monstrous, it's a chilling example of how a seemingly ordinary individual can transform into an embodiment of cruelty. Born in 1895 in Würzburg, Germany, Dirlewanger appeared to be a regular child. Little did anyone know within this boy lurked a darkness that would later erupt in horrifying ways. His early life seemed unremarkable. He pursued studies and showed an interest in academics, obtaining a doctorate in political science. However, beneath this veneer of normalcy, there were early signs of his troubling personality traits. Dirlewanger displayed an unsettling blend of intelligence and instability, a combination that would prove lethal in the years to come. World War I marked a turning point in Dirlewanger's life. He served with distinction, receiving the Iron Cross for bravery. But the war did more than decorate him with medals. It exposed him to the brutalities of conflict, possibly nurturing his latent violent tendencies. The end of the war found Dirlewanger adrift, like many veterans, struggling to adjust to a peacetime world that seemed alien to his war-hardened sensibilities. The post-war years saw Dirlewanger's descent into a life of crime. He was convicted for illegal possession of explosives and firearms, hinting at a growing fascination with violence. However, it was his abhorrent sexual crimes, particularly against minors, that revealed the depth of his depravity. Despite these heinous acts, Dirlewanger's connections within the Nazi Party, notably with his old comrade Gottlob Berger, shielded him from lasting repercussions. His reintegration into the party and the SS after brief periods of incarceration exemplified the corrupt and morally bankrupt nature of the Nazi regime. In 1939, with the outbreak of World War II, Dirlewanger found his true calling. He was placed in charge of a special unit, initially composed of former poachers. This unit, under Dirlewanger's command, would become infamous for its composition and conduct. It was a motley crew of society's outcasts, criminals, the mentally unstable, and the degenerate. In Dirlewanger's hands, they were molded into an instrument of terror. As the war progressed, the Dirlewanger Brigade, as it came to be known, gained a notorious reputation. They were unleashed on the Eastern Front, where they engaged not only in combat against enemy soldiers, but also in unspeakable atrocities against civilians. The unit specialized in anti-partisan warfare, a euphemism for brutal suppression of resistance, which often involved massacring entire villages, rape, and other acts of extreme violence. The horrors perpetrated by Dirlewanger and his brigade were so extreme that even other SS units and the Wehrmacht were appalled. Reports of their atrocities include instances where they herded women and children into buildings before setting them ablaze, shooting anyone who tried to escape. The cruelty of these acts cannot be overstated. They were not merely acts of war. They were manifestations of Dirlewanger's own sadistic impulses. What drove Dirlewanger to such extremes of barbarity? Some historians suggest that his experiences in World War I played a role, while others point to a pre-existing psychopathic personality. Certainly, his actions during the war were not those of a mere soldier following orders. They were the actions of a man who found pleasure in cruelty and chaos. In examining Dirlewanger's life, one cannot ignore the broader context of the Nazi regime. His rise and the formation of his brigade were only possible in a system that valued brutality and rewarded ruthlessness. Dirlewanger was a product of his time, a time when the worst elements of human nature were not only unleashed, but encouraged and celebrated. Formation of the Dirlewanger Brigade. The formation of the Dirlewanger Brigade, a unit synonymous with unparalleled brutality and ruthlessness, is a dark chapter in military history. The brigade, officially known as the SS Sonderkommando Dirlewanger, was an anomaly even within the notorious SS structure of Nazi Germany. This chapter explores how this infamous unit came to be and the factors that shaped its notorious legacy. The genesis of the Dirlewanger Brigade can be traced back to 1940 amidst the chaos of World War II. The idea was initially born out of a need for specialized units to combat the rising partisan resistance, particularly on the Eastern Front. Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the SS's brutal policies, envisioned a unit that could operate with unrestrained ferocity against the enemies of the Reich. Enter Oskar Dirlewanger, a man with a reputation for both military prowess and sadistic tendencies. His background in the First World War, coupled with his connections within the Nazi Party, made him a suitable, albeit controversial, choice for leading such a unit. Despite his criminal record, Dirlewanger was seen as someone who could instill fear and enforce the ruthless policies of the Nazi regime. The initial composition of the Dirlewanger Brigade was as unusual as its commander. The unit began as a battalion-sized group, primarily composed of convicted poachers. Himmler believed that the skills of these poachers, accustomed to stalking and killing in the wilderness, would be valuable in anti-partisan operations. This unconventional recruitment strategy was reflective of the SS's willingness to experiment with different approaches in the conduct of the war. As the war progressed, the criteria for recruitment into the Dirlewanger Brigade broadened alarmingly. The unit swelled with a mix of criminals, from petty offenders to hardened murderers, rapists, and arsonists. It was a gathering of some of the most violent and deranged individuals, many of whom were released from prisons and concentration camps with the understanding that they would serve in this punitive force. The brigade thus became a cesspool of the Reich's most deplorable elements, unified under the banner of the SS and given free rein to unleash their sadistic impulses. The training and indoctrination of the brigade were reflective of its unique composition. Discipline was brutally enforced, often through violent means, creating an environment where cruelty was not just tolerated but encouraged. Dirlewanger himself led by example, demonstrating a penchant for brutality that was enthusiastically adopted by his men. This created a unit that operated with a level of savagery that was shocking even by the standards of the Eastern Front. The primary mission of the Dirlewanger Brigade was anti-partisan warfare, a task they approached with unmatched ferocity. Unlike conventional military units, the brigade was not restrained by the usual rules of engagement. They operated more as a marauding gang than a military unit, leaving a trail of destruction and atrocities in their wake. Villages suspected of harboring partisans were razed, their inhabitants massacred without distinction between combatants and civilians. The actions of the Dirlewanger Brigade were marked by a pattern of extreme violence. Reports from the period detail incidents of mass shootings, rape, and the use of civilians as human shields. In some instances, entire communities were wiped out, their inhabitants killed, and their homes burned to the ground. These atrocities were not incidental acts of war, but were part of a systematic approach to terrorize and subjugate the civilian population. The reputation of the Dirlewanger Brigade grew infamous even among other SS units. Their brutality was such that it often hindered rather than helped the German war effort, provoking fierce resistance and further alienating the local population. Despite this, the brigade continued to receive support from high-ranking officials within the Nazi hierarchy who valued their effectiveness in instilling terror over any military or strategic considerations. Reign of Terror. The atrocities unleashed. The Dirlewanger Brigade's reign of terror stands as one of the most brutal episodes in the annals of modern warfare. Under the command of Oskar Dirlewanger, this unit not only fought against military adversaries, but also engaged in a systematic campaign of atrocities against civilians, leaving a scar in the history of World War II. This chapter delves into the horrific acts committed by this notorious unit, illustrating the extent of their savagery. As the Dirlewanger Brigade marched into the Eastern Front, they brought with them a level of brutality that was unprecedented even in the ruthless standards of the Nazi regime. The unit's primary mission was ostensibly anti-partisan warfare, but in reality, it evolved into a campaign of terror against the civilian population. Dirlewanger's men, a motley crew of criminals and psychopaths, unleashed a reign of terror, marked by indiscriminate killings, rape, and unimaginable cruelty. One of the most notorious episodes involving the Dirlewanger Brigade was their participation in the suppression of the Warsaw Uprising in 1944. The uprising, a heroic yet desperate attempt by the Polish resistance to liberate Warsaw from German occupation, was met with unprecedented ferocity by the Nazi forces, with the Dirlewanger Brigade playing a lead role. Their actions during this period were characterized by savage brutality and complete disregard for human life. In Warsaw, the Dirlewanger Brigade engaged in mass executions, systematically rounding up and shooting civilians. Women and children were not spared in these massacres. The unit was also infamous for its use of rape as a weapon of war. Reports from the time speak of widespread sexual violence committed by Dirlewanger's men, often in full view of the victims' families. The brutality was not only physical, but also psychological, with the brigade employing terror tactics to break the spirit of the resistance and the will of the people. The brigade's tactics were not limited to urban warfare. In rural areas, they were known for their scorched earth tactics, destroying entire villages suspected of harboring or supporting partisans. One method involved herding the inhabitants into barns or other large buildings, setting these structures on fire, and then shooting anyone who tried to escape. This tactic was not only a means of exterminating resistance, but also a calculated effort to instill fear among the civilian population. The scale of the atrocities committed by the Dirlewanger Brigade was staggering. In Belarus alone, they were responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of civilians. Their preferred method of operation, combining mass killings with destruction of property and brutalization of survivors, left a trail of devastation across the Eastern Front. The unit's actions were so extreme that they were sometimes condemned by other German military units, who viewed their conduct as counterproductive and unnecessarily barbaric. The cruelty of the Dirlewanger Brigade was not an anomaly, but rather a reflection of the unit's composition and leadership. Dirlewanger himself was a man who relished violence and encouraged his men to act without restraint. This culture of brutality was further exacerbated by the nature of the recruits, many of whom were hardened criminals released from prisons and concentration camps. For these men, serving in the Dirlewanger Brigade provided an opportunity to indulge their most sadistic impulses under the guise of military service. The brutality of the Dirlewanger Brigade extended beyond physical violence to include looting, pillaging, and wanton destruction. They often stole from the very communities they were destroying, taking whatever valuables they could find and leaving a wake of poverty and despair. This behavior further alienated the local populations and fueled resistance movements, ironically undermining the very purpose for which the brigade was ostensibly formed. Despite the widespread knowledge of their atrocities, the Dirlewanger Brigade continued to operate with impunity. Their actions were not only tolerated, but often implicitly encouraged by the higher echelons of the Nazi regime. This permissive attitude towards extreme violence was indicative of the moral bankruptcy of the Nazi leadership, which placed ideological goals above basic human decency. The reign of terror unleashed by the Dirlewanger Brigade stands as a stark reminder of the horrors of war and the depths of human cruelty. Their campaign of violence was not a mere byproduct of the chaos of war, but a deliberate strategy of terror and subjugation. The legacy of the Dirlewanger Brigade is a grim testament to what can happen when the worst elements of humanity are given free rein to act out their darkest impulses. The fall of a tyrant. The downfall of Oskar Dirlewanger and the disbandment of his notorious brigade mark a significant chapter in the history of World War II. This chapter examines the circumstances leading to the collapse of Dirlewanger's reign of terror, his capture, and the eventual demise of one of the most brutal figures in the SS. As the tide of World War II turned against Germany, the Dirlewanger Brigade, notorious for its trail of atrocities, found itself increasingly on the defensive. The relentless advance of the Allied forces and the Red Army began to erode the territories held by the Nazis. For Dirlewanger and his brigade, this meant a retreat under pressure, but not without leaving a path of destruction in their wake. Dirlewanger's fall began in earnest in 1945. The Red Army's relentless push westward had put immense pressure on all German forces, including the Dirlewanger Brigade. Engaged in fierce battles on the Eastern Front, particularly in Hungary and the borders of Germany, the brigade suffered heavy losses. The once feared unit, filled with criminals and outcasts, began to crumble under the weight of a well-organized and determined enemy. The endgame for Dirlewanger came with the Battle of Berlin. Amidst the chaos of the collapsing Third Reich, he attempted to rally his remaining forces to defend the Nazi capital. However, by this time, the Dirlewanger Brigade was a shadow of its former self, its numbers depleted, and its morale shattered. The once feared unit was unable to withstand the onslaught of the advancing Soviet troops. In the final days of the war, Dirlewanger found himself a fugitive, fleeing from the justice that awaited him for his numerous war crimes. His attempts to evade capture were in vain. In June 1945, he was apprehended by French occupation troops in Altshausen, Germany. The tyrant, who had instilled fear in the hearts of so many, was now a prisoner, stripped of his power and facing retribution for his actions. Dirlewanger's capture marked a significant moment in the pursuit of justice post-war. For the survivors and the families of his victims, his arrest was a long-awaited step towards closure. However, justice would take a different form for Dirlewanger. Before he could be brought to trial, he met a violent end in prison under circumstances that remain somewhat mysterious but indicative of the hatred he had engendered. According to reports, Dirlewanger was recognized by Polish guards in the prison who subjected him to a brutal beating. This was a personal vendetta for the guards, many of whom had suffered directly or indirectly at the hands of Dirlewanger's brigade. His death, on June 7, 1945, was a result of the injuries sustained during this beating. The man who had perpetrated so much violence and cruelty met an end befitting the brutality he had shown others. The demise of Oskar Dirlewanger did not, however, close the chapter on the horrors he had unleashed. The legacy of his actions continued to haunt the regions he had terrorized, and the survivors struggled to rebuild their lives from the ashes of the destruction he had caused. The memories of the atrocities committed by Dirlewanger and his brigade remained a painful reminder of the human capacity for evil. The fall of Dirlewanger also raised important questions about justice and retribution. While some saw his violent death as a fitting end for a war criminal of his caliber, others argued that a formal trial would have been more appropriate, ensuring a legal and moral reckoning for his crimes. His death in prison denied the world an opportunity to publicly confront the atrocities he had committed and to hold him accountable in a court of law. In the aftermath of Dirlewanger's death, the remnants of his brigade were disbanded and scattered. Many of his men were captured and faced trials for their involvement in war crimes. The dissolution of the brigade marked the end of a unit that had become synonymous with the worst excesses of the Nazi regime. The aftermath and legacy. The aftermath of Oskar Dirlewanger's reign of terror and the disbandment of his notorious brigade reverberated long after the end of World War II. This chapter explores the lasting impact of Dirlewanger's actions and the complex legacy he left behind, reflecting on the broader implications for our understanding of history, morality, and justice. The immediate aftermath of the war saw a Europe in ruins, grappling with the immense task of rebuilding and reconciliation. For the communities that had endured the horrors inflicted by the Dirlewanger Brigade, the end of the war did not immediately erase the trauma they had experienced. The memories of the atrocities committed lingered, a haunting legacy that would take generations to overcome. In many areas, the physical and emotional scars left by Dirlewanger's brutality were indelible, forever altering the landscape of the regions he had terrorized. The pursuit of justice for the victims of the Dirlewanger Brigade was a complex and often frustrating process. While Dirlewanger himself met a violent end, many of his subordinates were captured and tried for war crimes. However, the trials and subsequent punishments varied widely, with some members of the brigade facing severe consequences while others managed to evade justice, blending back into post-war society. This inconsistent application of justice left many questioning the effectiveness and fairness of the post-war legal processes. The legacy of Oskar Dirlewanger and his brigade also had a significant impact on the historiography of World War II. Their story is a stark reminder of the depths of human depravity that can be reached under the guise of warfare and ideology. Historians and scholars have struggled to comprehend the full extent of the brigade's atrocities, often finding it challenging to reconcile the scale of their brutality with any conventional understanding of human behavior. Dirlewanger's life and actions have also become a subject of study in the fields of psychology and criminology. His transformation from a decorated World War I veteran to a notorious war criminal has been analyzed as a case study in the development of psychopathic behavior. The formation and operation of the Dirlewanger Brigade provide a disturbing example of how systemic brutality can be fostered and encouraged within a military organization. The broader legacy of Dirlewanger's actions extends to our understanding of morality and ethics in times of war. The atrocities committed by his brigade challenge the conventional boundaries of military conduct and underscore the importance of maintaining ethical standards, even in the most extreme circumstances. The story of the Dirlewanger Brigade serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of dehumanizing the enemy and the slippery slope that can lead to unspeakable acts of violence. In the years following the war, the memory of the Dirlewanger Brigade continued to influence public discourse on war crimes and justice. The brigade's actions became emblematic of the worst excesses of the Nazi regime, contributing to the broader understanding of the Holocaust and the systematic atrocities committed during World War II. The story of Dirlewanger and his men has been invoked in discussions about the need for vigilance against totalitarian ideologies and the necessity of confronting and condemning acts of genocide and ethnic cleansing. The legacy of Oskar Dirlewanger is also reflected in the collective memory of the nations and communities he affected. In Poland, Belarus, and other parts of Eastern Europe, the memories of the Dirlewanger Brigade's atrocities remain a poignant part of the historical narrative. These memories serve as a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable cruelty and the importance of remembering and honoring the victims of such atrocities. Reflections on justice and remembrance. In the wake of the devastation left by Oskar Dirlewanger and his brigade, the post-war world faced critical questions about justice, remembrance, and the processes of dealing with such profound atrocities. This chapter delves into the aftermath of Dirlewanger's brutal campaign, reflecting on how societies grapple with the legacy of war criminals and the importance of remembrance in shaping our collective history. The end of World War II initiated a massive international effort to bring Nazi war criminals to justice. The Nuremberg trials are the most notable, but countless other lesser-known trials sought to prosecute those responsible for war crimes, including members of the Dirlewanger Brigade. These trials were monumental in establishing legal precedents for crimes against humanity and genocide. However, the case of Dirlewanger and many of his men remained unresolved, as they never stood trial. This gap in legal justice underscores the challenges faced in holding all perpetrators accountable, especially when they evade capture or die before facing trial. Remembering the atrocities committed by Dirlewanger and his brigade poses a complex challenge. How do societies remember such dark figures without glorifying their actions? Memorialization efforts often focus on honoring the victims rather than highlighting the perpetrators. However, remembering the evil that men like Dirlewanger embodied is crucial in understanding history's darker chapters. It involves a delicate balance of acknowledging the brutality and learning from it, ensuring that such events are not repeated. The horrific actions of the Dirlewanger Brigade have become a crucial part of Holocaust and World War II education. They are often cited as extreme examples of moral decay and the dangers of unchecked power and fanaticism. The story of Dirlewanger and his brigade is taught not only for its historical significance, but also as a moral lesson on the importance of ethical conduct and the responsibility of individuals within a society. The portrayal of Dirlewanger and his brigade in media and culture plays a significant role in shaping public perception and memory. Films, books, and documentaries that delve into the darker aspects of the Nazi regime often mention Dirlewanger as an embodiment of its most extreme brutality. While these portrayals help in keeping the memory alive, They also run the risk of sensationalizing or misrepresenting the events, which can distort public understanding. The case of Dirlewanger has also been of interest in psychological and criminal studies, providing insights into the mind of a war criminal. Understanding his psychological makeup and the dynamics within his brigade helps in comprehending how ordinary individuals can be transformed into agents of extreme violence. This understanding is crucial in preventing the emergence of similar figures in the future. The legacy of Dirlewanger also prompts broader societal reflections. It raises questions about the conditions that allow such individuals to gain power and the collective responsibility of societies to prevent such occurrences. The story of Dirlewanger serves as a grim reminder of what can happen when societal norms and legal systems fail to check the rise of individuals with destructive ideologies. On an international level, the legacy of Dirlewanger has influenced discussions on war crimes and the need for global cooperation in preventing and prosecuting such acts. His actions, along with those of other war criminals, have shaped international laws and treaties designed to protect human rights and ensure accountability for war crimes.